You ever hear about a story where hatred ends up destroying the haters instead? Well, this one might just blow your mind. Meet James Turner, a quiet, hard-working black man living in the small town of Maple Creek, Georgia. James had a simple routine: work during the week, and on weekends, he'd grab his old fishing pole and head down to the lake behind his house. That lake wasn't just water to him. It was peace. It was where he talked to God, where he escaped the noise of the world, and where he remembered his late father, who taught him how to fish when he was just 6. The gentle lap of water against the reeds was a lullaby, and the patient wait for a bite was a meditation. On that bank, he was just a man, whole and untroubled. But there was one problem. That lake, though it stretched behind James's property, technically sat within the area controlled by the Homeowners Association, the HOA. Now, if you've ever dealt with an HOA, you already know they can make life miserable over things as small as grass height or mailbox color. But in James's case, the HOA had something much uglier brewing beneath the surface: racism. The association was presided over by a man named Bill Hendricks, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, flinty eyes. Bill saw James's presence not as a neighbor enjoying nature, but as a transgression. To him and a few others on the board, the lake was a pristine, private heirloom, and James's peaceful fishing was a stain on its imagined perfection. The trouble started subtly. A formal letter arrived, citing a rarely enforced bylaw about unauthorized use of common areas. James ignored it. He'd been fishing there for 5 years without issue. Then came a fine for disturbing the aquatic ecosystem. When that didn't work, the tactics turned overtly hostile. One Saturday, Bill and his vice president, a weaselly man named Roy, marched down to the bank. "Turner, you know this is private property," Bill said, his voice dripping with false civility. "You're trespassing." James kept his eyes on the water, his voice calm but firm. "The access is for my land, Bill, and my deed has an easement for recreational use. I've checked." Bill's face tightened. The law wasn't on his side, but his hatred was. "We'll see about that." The harassment escalated. They tried to have the easement legally invalidated, but a town clerk, sympathetic to James, misplaced the paperwork for weeks. They then launched a campaign of whispers and lies, suggesting James was leaving trash or scaring the wildlife. They even proposed building a fence along the property line, a project that would have cost the HOA thousands just to block his view and access. But James was an oak, not a reed. He bent, but did not break. He continued to fish, his quiet dignity a silent rebuke to their venom. He began bringing his young nephew with him, teaching him the same patience and peace his father had taught him. This, more than anything, seemed to ignite a special kind of fury in Bill Hendricks. The sight of 2 generations of black men finding joy on his lake was an intolerable provocation. Bill's obsession with destroying James's peace became all-consuming. He spent countless HOA funds on legal consultations, all of which led nowhere. He called emergency meetings, ranting about property values and community standards, his face perpetually flushed with anger. The other board members, once compliant, grew weary. They saw the mounting costs and the ugly truth of the crusade. The unity of the neighborhood began to fracture under the weight of Bill's bigotry. The hatred, having found no external purchase, began to turn inward. It started to consume the very vessel that carried it. Bill Hendricks was no longer just the HOA president. He was becoming a prisoner of his own poison, and his downfall was already written on the still, reflective surface of the water James loved so much. It all started when James moved into the neighborhood about 3 years ago. At first, folks offered tight, perfunctory smiles from across manicured lawns. But when they saw him week after week, heading down to the water with his old fishing pole, the polite facade began to crack, and the rumors began to slither through the cul-de-sacs like a low-lying fog. Some HOA members, clustered around mailboxes or at the clubhouse, claimed he was polluting the lake, though they could never produce a single piece of trash as evidence. Others, with pressed lips and shaking heads, insisted he was scaring the ducks, despite the fact that the waterfowl would often paddle placidly a few feet from where he sat. The most creative accusation was that he was disturbing the community's peace and aesthetic. It was total nonsense. James was a ghost on that bank, a silent, still figure who always cleaned up after himself, practiced catch and release, and never caused a whisper of trouble. His crime wasn't his actions. It was his presence. His peace was an affront to theirs. Then came the letter. It arrived in a crisp, official-looking envelope, the kind that usually contained HOA dues reminders. But the contents were different. It read, Mr. Turner, under Section 14B of Community Regulations, fishing in the Lakeview Commons retention pond is strictly prohibited without HOA approval. James, a meticulous man, went straight to his filing cabinet and pulled out the thick HOA handbook he'd received at closing. He spent the evening poring over it, his finger tracing each bylaw and amendment. He found sections on fence heights, shutter colors, and holiday decoration durations, but no Section 14B. Puzzled, he called a realtor friend who did some digging through county records. The discovery was both shocking and predictable, that Section 14B didn't even exist in the HOA handbook when James bought his house. It was a recent and very specific invention. They had literally scribbled a fake rule into their own ledger, a bureaucratic lie crafted for one purpose: to stop him from fishing. Believing in the power of reason, James tried to talk with them. He ironed a shirt, put on a tie, and attended the next HOA meeting to calmly explain the situation. He presented his deed, pointing out the legal easement for recreational use that gave him a right to access the water. He explained that the lake sat partially on his property line. He spoke with the quiet, logical patience of a man who believed a simple truth would win the day. But the HOA board, a panel of mostly older white residents led by Bill Hendricks, wasn't having it. Their faces were a wall of stony indifference. They dismissed his documents as legalistic trickery and his easement as a historical oversight. The discussion went in circles, a vortex of polite bureaucracy designed to exhaust him. As the meeting was adjourned, one board member, a man named Roy with perpetual sneer, leaned over as James gathered his papers. His voice was a low, venomous whisper meant for James's ears alone. You people always think rules don't apply to you. The words hung in the air, toxic and final. In that moment, the pretense fell away completely. The charade of fake section numbers and concern for ducks evaporated. James knew with a cold, sinking certainty that this wasn't about rules, property lines, or community aesthetics. It was about him, the color of his skin. His simple desire to sit by the water and find a moment of grace had been deemed an act of rebellion, and the war for his peace had officially begun. The first sign was a silence. That morning, when James walked down the familiar path, the air was devoid of its usual chorus. The dragonflies were gone. The frogs were silent. Reaching the bank, his heart seized. The water, usually a clear, dark mirror reflecting the Georgia pines, was a sickly, opaque pea green. Then he saw them. A dozen fish, their silver bellies turned up to the unforgiving sun, bobbed lifelessly near the shore. A thick, chemical odor, sharp and industrial, burned his nostrils, a smell that had no place in the sanctuary. A cold dread settled in his stomach. This was no natural algal bloom. This was an act. His first. Desperate hope was incompetence, not malice. He called the HOA office, his voice tight with concern. "There's something wrong with the lake," he reported. "The fish are dead. The water smells poison." The secretary who answered was dismissively cheerful. "Oh, I'm sure it's just the heat, Mr. Turner. We'll look into it." But the response felt rehearsed, the feigned ignorance too perfect. The pieces clicked into a horrifying picture. Their goal wasn't just to keep him from fishing. It was to ruin a place he loved, to scorch the earth so he could no longer find peace upon it. But James Turner was not a man who raged. He was a man who acted. He went back to the shore with a clean glass jar, his movements deliberate and grim. He waded into the tainted water, the unnatural warmth of it chilling him to his core, and filled the jar with the greenish poison. He drove the silent witness directly to the county's environmental services office, handing it to a technician with a simple, urgent request: "Please tell me what is in this water." A week of heavy silence passed. When the report arrived, it was a damning indictment. The analysis showed dangerously high levels of a powerful pesticide cocktail, mixed with a concentrated algae control toxin. The notes were explicit. These were chemicals designed to kill aquatic plant life, but the concentration found was nearly 10 times the recommended dosage. It was an overdose, a deliberate poisoning. It didn't just kill the fish, it had shattered the entire food chain, from the microscopic organisms to the insects that fed the birds. The lake was not just damaged, it was murdered. Driven by a furious resolve, James began his own investigation. A few discreet calls to landscaping companies in the area yielded the truth. The HOA, under Bill Hendricks's direct authorization, had hired a cheap, unlicensed contractor to treat the lake after a few residents had complained about mosquitoes. The contractor, eager for a quick payday, had dumped an entire truckload of chemicals into the water, far exceeding safe limits. They had done it in the dead of night, without notifying the city or the state environmental board, hoping to present it as a fait accompli. But in their single-minded focus on destroying James's refuge, they had committed a catastrophic blunder of breathtaking ignorance. They never bothered to check the town's hydrological survey maps. The lake wasn't an isolated retention pond. A subterranean aquifer, a slow-moving river of groundwater, connected it directly to Maple Creek Secondary Water Reservoir, a backup supply held for emergencies, for droughts, for fires. The very poison they had poured into his piece, the chemical weapon meant to drive one black man from his bank, was now seeping, gallon by deadly gallon, into the town's own veins. The hatred that festered in their hearts had not just killed the fish and silenced the frogs. It had, with a terrifying inevitability, begun to turn back on the town itself, contaminating the very foundation of their community. The trap they had laid for James was, in fact, a pit they had dug for themselves 0.2 months later. The Georgia sun, once a gentle warmth, became a brutal, unforgiving hammer. Maple Creek faced one of the worst droughts in a decade. The earth cracked, lawns turned to brittle straw, and the town's primary reservoir sank to mudcaked, historic lows. With a sense of grim necessity, the town council activated the emergency backup system, switching the entire water supply to the secondary reservoir, the one fed by the subterranean aquifer connected to the lake behind James Turner's house. Within days, the poison that had been seeping silently through the ground blossomed in the kitchens and bathrooms of Maple Creek. The complaint started as a trickle, then became a flood. Residents called in, aghast, reporting a sharp, chemical odor from their taps, a faint, sickly greenish tint to their water. Pets drinking from bowls on the floor vomited and grew lethargic. Prized rose bushes and manicured vegetable gardens, once the pride of the neighborhood, withered and died within 48 hours, their roots scorched by the tainted water. The crisis hit the town's economy square in the jaw. Local restaurants, the diner, and the coffee shop were forced to shut their doors, hanging signs that read, "Closed due to water emergency." Panic, a scent sharper than the chemical taint, began to permeate the air. The city launched a frantic investigation. It didn't take long for hydrologists and environmental technicians tracing the contamination upstream through the aquifer to arrive at the source. Their sensors led them directly to the HOA-managed lake. The water samples they took matched the toxins found in the town supply, the same potent pesticide, an algae cocktail from the report James had filed weeks earlier. When the news broke, it was absolute chaos. Vans from Atlanta news stations clogged the quiet streets of Maple Creek, their satellite dishes piercing the sky. Reporters shoved microphones in the faces of furious, frightened residents. The HOA board, led by Bill Hendricks, initially tried to circle the wagons, issuing a statement blaming an unlicensed contractor and an unfortunate accident. But their wall of denial crumbled in an instant when a landscaping company, facing its own ruin, provided a treasure trove of evidence to the district attorney. There were emails, invoices, and most damningly, a written work order signed by Bill Hendricks himself. In the margin, in his own distinct handwriting, were the instructions that would seal his fate. Apply treatment with sufficient strength to make sure the water stays clear enough so that man can't fish there anymore. Yep, it was right there in writing. The petty, racist motive was now a matter of public record, inextricably linked to an ecological and public health disaster. The state's response was swift and severe. The HOA was buried under an avalanche of fines from the Environmental Protection Division. Class action lawsuits from residents and business owners piled up like autumn leaves. The cost of the environmental cleanup, which involved draining the entire lake and treating the contaminated soil, was projected to cost the county nearly $3 million, a bill that was ultimately passed on to the residents in the form of a special tax. Bill Hendricks and several other board members were indicted on charges of criminal negligence and conspiracy, their reputations and freedom hanging in the balance. The HOA, drowning in debt and disgrace, was forced into bankruptcy and dissolved. And James? He didn't give interviews. He didn't stand on a podium and say, "I told you so." He simply sat on his porch, watching the parade of official vehicles and news vans. He watched as the very people who had tried to poison his peace, who had sought to destroy his small slice of heaven, were forced to drink the bitter dregs of their own hatred. The lake was gone, drained to a muddy scar, but in its place was profound and terrible justice. They had not merely broken the law. They had broken a fundamental covenant with their own community, and in the end, the hatred they had unleashed was the very toxin that destroyed them. The restoration of the lake was a slow, deliberate process, watched over by the town with a penitent gaze. Engineers and ecologists worked for months, dredging the poisoned silt, reintroducing beneficial bacteria, and carefully replanting the shoreline with native grasses. The first spring rain that followed felt like a baptism, washing the last of the chemical memory from the earth. And then life, resilient and tenacious, began its quiet return. A solitary frog croaked one evening, a sound that was met with cheers from a nearby porch. A pair of mallards soon followed, skidding to a landing on the water as if they had never left. On a Saturday morning washed in golden light, James walked down the now firm path, the grip of his old fishing pole familiar in his hand. The scent was clean, of wet earth and new growth. He cast his line into the renewed water, the plop of the sinker a perfect punctuation to the morning silence. But this time he wasn't alone. Slowly, tentatively, they came. Dozens of residents, many of whom had once averted their eyes or remained silent during the HOA's campaign, joined him on the shore. They brought folding chairs, coolers of soda, and baskets of sandwiches. There was no grand ceremony, no orchestrated reconciliation. It was a quiet, collective gathering, an unspoken acknowledgement of a wrong that had been righted. Mrs. Gable from Elm Street, whose prize-winning hydrangeas had been casualties of the tainted water, brought him a slice of homemade peach pie. Old Mr. Peterson, who had once complained about the unsightliness of James's presence, sat on a stump nearby, not fishing, just watching the water, his presence an apology in itself. The same community that had once judged him now thanked him in quiet, practical ways, because they all understood a terrifying truth. If James hadn't been so vigilant, if he hadn't taken that single water sample, the entire town might have been silently drinking that poison for months, with consequences far graver than dead roses. A young reporter from the revived Maple Creek Gazette approached him, not with the aggression of the city news crews, but with a respectful humility. James, who had refused all comment during the height of the scandal, finally agreed to speak. In the following day's paper, his quote was printed not as a headline, but as a standalone block, set apart for emphasis. When people hate you for just existing, they forget that what they do to hurt you might hurt everyone. Their anger is like a fire they can't control. This lake didn't need defending because it was mine. It needed defending because it gives life. We all depend on the same water. We all breathe the same air. The words resonated through the town with the force of a sermon. They were simple, but they laid bare the profound, interconnected truth that the HOA's bigotry had blinded them to. The HOA that had tried to silence him, to run him off, no longer existed. Its bylaws and petty regulations had vanished into the legal ether. Its power dissolved into memory and warning. The Section 14B they had invented to target him was now just a footnote in the story of their downfall. And in the middle of it all stood James, calm, patient, and still fishing. The line between his past solitude and his present community was his fishing rod, a thread connecting him to the deep, restorative peace of the water. He had not fought fire with fire. He had fought poison with truth. He had endured the storm without becoming the storm. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting or fighting. It isn't rage or violence. It's the quiet strength to hold your ground, to maintain your dignity, and to wait with unwavering patience for the truth to surface, just as a fish, after a long and patient wait, finally rises through the clear, clean water to break the surface.